welcome to TV Bookshelf. I'm David Lenander with the Rivendell Discussion Group of the Mythopoeic Society, and today I'm excited to have Professor Jack Zipes from the University of Minnesota, Department of German, Dutch, and Scandinavian Languages.
That's correct.
I hope that's right. And Professor Zipes has written many books. He's edited a number of important writers like Hermann Hesse's stories. He's translated fairy tales from the French and the German and is probably the expert on the Brothers Grimm. He's a world-famous expert on fairy tales, and he's also taken an interest in both children's and adult fantasy, among other topics, in some of his books in the past. I'd like to mention just a few of those books. In my hands, I have one of his most recent, Sticks and Stones, The Troublesome Success of Children's Literature from Slovenly Peter to Harry Potter. And I have to say, this was a very exciting book to me when I read it last year, and I certainly was most excited by this book of any nonfiction book I read last year. But some of the other books that Professor Zipes has done have been Don't Bet on the Prince, Contemporary Feminist Fairy Tales in North America and England, which I think includes a story of your own, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And Fairy Tale as Myth, Myth as Fairy Tale, which I think is one of the most accessible among your books, which is essays on not only some of the classic texts, but also on some more recent writers, from Tolkien to Jane Yolen, I believe. And Creative Storytelling, Building Community, Changing Lives, Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales, Children and the Culture Industry, The Oxford Companion to Fairy Tales, The Western Fairy Tale Tradition from Medieval to Modern. That's a massive tome. And another one that people often mention is Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion, which is listed here, but I do remember that book quite well. One book that I wanted to talk a little bit about is When Dreams Came True, which is a recent book of yours in which you collected a number of introductions that you had done to books like the Hermann Hesse collection, and I think also to Anderson fairy tales. Or no, I'm sorry, you even reprised an essay you'd written over on Anderson. And I had expected this to be a disparate collection of essays that would be interesting from a historical point of view, but what I hadn't expected is that it would hang together so well as kind of a history and guidebook to fantasy literature through a couple of centuries. And I was impressed with that.
Well, thank you very much. I've been very fortunate over the past 15 years. I have a very nice editor, or two editors, at Penguin, Signet, and Viking. They're all one publishing house, and they have a series of classical books, and they quite often include fairy tale authors like Oscar Wilde and Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio and L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz. And over the years, they've asked me to write fairly long introductions to these books. And when I regarded them, and I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago, I realized that there was a history of the classical fairy tale tradition in the West, and also these introductions they tend to become buried. Quite often people don't read introductions or don't even know you've written introductions, and I decided to assemble them, and lo and behold, there was this sort of chronological history beginning basically with the French classical writers. I wish I had also an essay. I have written on Straparole and Basile, who are actually the founders of the literary fairy tale tradition in the West, but I did not have an essay, but I covered them in a longish introduction covering the entire period, and thank you very much. I enjoyed putting the essays together, also revising them. It gave me a chance to revise some of the essays, and I might actually, I just finished an essay, a long introduction to Peter Pan, actually Peter and Wendy, the novel that was published in 1911. The play was not published officially until 1928. It was produced in 1904, and it gave me a great opportunity to go back and study J.M. Barrie and the tradition of fantasy at the end of the 19th century, and to reinterpret Peter Pan, and to look at some of the films that have come out since the 1940s.
Peter Pan originally appeared in The White Bird.
That's correct. Well, there was Peter Pan has a very interesting history, and there is also Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens.
Mm-hmm.
That was taken out of The White Bird and published separately in 1908 with very interesting illustrations by Arthur Rackham. And then finally the novel came out in 1911, which was, again, quite different, not remarkably different, but quite different from the play, which most people don't realize he kept, Barrie revised that play almost every year, practically until he died. Even after it was published in 1928, he was always tampering with the play, never in ways that created difficulties. That is, there weren't great cuts or changes. But the novel is fascinating because most people don't read it. They don't even know it exists. And I have mixed feelings about it.
And this was originally published as Peter and Wendy.
That's right, Peter and Wendy, and it's a very there's a book by Jacqueline Rose called The Case of Peter Pan, highly critical study from a Lacanian point of view, but also with a lot of history about the reception of the work, and Jacqueline Rose basically takes not only Barrie to task, but most writers of children's literature, arguing that essentially writers of children's literature manipulate the characters in such a way to develop a notion of childhood which has very little to do with the reality of childhood, but a great deal to do with their own psychological problems and how they want childhood to be viewed by readers. And she insinuates somewhat that there's a type of abuse going on that may even be related to the way that Barrie abused the Loveland Davies, 5 sons, a family who served as the basis for Peter and Pan. And there is something to that, but I think literature has to stand on its own merits, and that we have to be careful about this connection of autobiography with the text. What I found interesting was in rereading the novel after many years, I did find it somewhat not boring, but tedious, and certainly not written for children. I mean, Barrie never wrote for children. And most in Sticks and Stones, I argue that most children's literature is never really written primarily for children. That may be the intended audience, but essentially everyone begins by writing for oneself, and then after that the editors and who are all adults, and then after that maybe there's some type of intended audience that becomes involved. And also I argue and believe that the best of children's literature is great literature. It's just simply great literature, and I don't know why we have to designate it specifically as children's literature.
Do you think that reaching back to the book on Peter Pan and the case of Peter Pan, do you think that her arguments are they limited in that book? I haven't read it to just Barrie, or is she extending that to a lot?
Well, it's basically to Barrie, but she does mention other authors, but it's not a long book. It's about 200 or so pages, and I really respect this study. I think that if I were to teach a course on children's literature, I would definitely insist that this would be the book to read, and then begin by criticizing her theses or looking at her theses critically. But it has a great deal to offer, because I think that there's so many misconceptions about what childhood is, who children are, what children's literature involves, what types of genres there exist for children, and also I think that it's a type of work that can be used, can be applied to studies of other major classical works, or practically any book that is published supposedly or allegedly for children. Very important book.
Some of your other books have been, well, let me ask you, what do you think is your most important book?
Well, I have a fondness for 2 or 3 of the books, or special fondness. I tend to like everything that I publish, otherwise I don't think I would publish it, come out in the public. Sometimes I think a book will do better or be better received than I anticipate. I published 3 years ago, 2 different types of books that I'll talk about. One is a collection of fairy tales, and the other is a critical book. Let me begin with the collection of fairy tales, which I'm rather fond of. It's called The Great Tradition, the Great Fairy Tale Tradition, from Straparole and Basile to the Brothers Grimm, and it's about 1,000 pages long, and it includes all the tales, all the major tales that were published before the Brothers Grimm published their collection, and it is divided by type tales. So if you were to read the book, you would see under Cinderella there would be 4 or 5 different types of tales, by Basile, by Perrault, by Madame d'Aulnoy, by the Grimms, all that precede, and then of course always a tale by the Grimms. There are tales that have to deal with for instance, Puss in Boots, where you have one by Straparola, one by Basile, one by Perrault, and so on. And I translated all of these tales and wrote introductions to every one of the sections. There are about 33 sections. And I wrote a long introduction about the history of the fairy tale. And in the back of the book, it's intended for college use, although I had hoped that it might be sold as a trade book as well. In the back of the book, there are 5 essays by outstanding scholars on the different phases of the fairy tale, from the 16th century all the way up to the present. And it's a collection I had been dying to do for about 20 years. Fortunately, the publishing house, W.W. Norton, that does many books, college texts and collections for universities, came to me about 4 or 5 years ago, and it took me about 2 or 3 years to do all the translations from the Italian, French, German, and also from Latin. There are many different translations. And I'm thrilled that the book is out and available. My only regret is that I really wanted to, I published another book called Spells and Enchantments, also a big anthology of fairy tales, literary fairy tales. And that was for the general educated audience, and this one too has that potential, but I can't convince my publishers to do away with some of the academic apparatus and make that book more available to a general public, because I think that readers of fairy tales and fantasy would just love this anthology, because it is so unusual. It's very unique, and you get to see this whole tradition before the Brothers Grimm, because most readers of fairy tales have a myopic view of what a fairy tale is. They think a fairy tale is, well, the Brothers Grimm or Anderson, and that's about it. After that, it falls off. And this book, I think rectifies our notion, or let me say, revises or helps adjust our vision as to what the fairy tales are. The other book that I'm fond of is Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion, which I wrote many years ago. And it's, I think, a book that really, it was my second major book on fairy tales, but it was conceived in a way that it enabled me really to comprehend what direction I was going to go with regard to analyzing fairy tales. And basically, I tried to analyze the civilizing process in the Western world, how we civilize and acculturate and socialize not only children but adults, and how fairy tales enter into this system of civilizing, because the fairy tales, no matter what their perspective may be, ideologically, morally, ethically, and aesthetically, really impart notions of manners and mores, and must be considered, particularly since it's the genre which stays with us throughout most of our lives. We hear fairy tales when we're babies and children. We read them when we're very young, and throughout our lives they stay with us. And this is not true of most literary genres, or even in the oral tradition. And because of this, I try to demonstrate historically how the fairy tale was closely connected to civilizing processes in different countries, and how even today, up through today, they do play a role in socializing children and into the mass media through film, of course, today. And Walt Disney is the great sort of Brothers Grimm, or one brother, who took over the fairy tale, and of course these tales have a very powerful effect on the way children become culturated in the United States. And there are other, of course, other film directors and producers like Shelley Duvall or Jim Henson and Tom Davenport. I could name many. Fairy tale has spread. It's not just the literary form anymore.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen some of the films by Miyazaki in the last few years?
Oh, yes. He is absolutely brilliant. I saw Spirited Away in Italian in Rome last year. Came out and with a different title. It was called The Enchanted Forest. And I had not seen, for some strange reason, had not seen any of his films until last year, and it was so breathtaking, the visuals, the landscapes, the development of the characters, the story itself, that when I came back to the States, I immediately bought 5 of the videos, and since then I've now seen almost all of his films, and I think he's splendid. I mean, he is, as far as I'm concerned, an antidote to the Disney take on the world, because he has a very, very sensitive and sensible understanding of the problems of young people. I also like the fact that in almost all of his films, the major heroes, the protagonists, never marry, and they're mainly feminine. They're feminine or feminist protagonists who are the focus of many of his films. So I've been just delighted to discover him, and I wish I had discovered him some time ago, but I hope to do some writing on his work.
My daughter has loved for years the one that's known as My Neighbor Totoro. I don't know what the Japanese name is.
Uh-huh.
But, when I first saw it, I was just amazed by the little girls running across the yard. You know, early they come to the house,
Yes.
and their mouths open so that the mouth almost fills the face. And all I could think was, Disney would have never done little girls that way. might have done little boys something like
Right.
that.
Right.
But that is very characteristic of somehow you see that, and even though it's a cartoon,
Yeah.
you see the reality in children that you know or
Right, right. I forget the title of the one that I viewed recently, Princess
Mononoke.
Mononoke, and that was fascinating because not only it was also about the environment. It was a brilliant film about the environment and also about the friendship that is formed between this young warrior who's wounded at the very beginning of the film, is poisoned, is carrying this poison, and the wolf girl who is trying to save the forest and protect the animals. Again, and what was interesting is that there were a lot of immoral or criminal characters, and yet he did not punish them. There is I don't know whether it's a Buddhist vision of the world, but that no one is entirely evil in the film. There are evil possibilities.
I do like the ambiguity of some of those characters.
Yes, and so that at the end, no one is really punished, so to speak, in any severe way. They go on living side by side, of course, opposed to one another or engaged with one another. And the film also is unlike most American films that have violence in them. It's not violence for violence sake. It's not these wars or battles are fought because they will excite or titillate the audiences, the spectators. But there's always a meaning to the conflict. You know, whatever is happening has to happen, regrettably, because people don't get along or they have vested interests, they're greedy, and so on. And I think that film really captures something that is really crucial for children to understand, and adults, of course.
Well, I'm going to look forward to what you write about that. What else are you working on right now?
Well, I just finished a collection of, I've been doing a lot of work in Italy and Sicily, and in fact, this week a new book is coming out called Beautiful Angiola, The Great Treasury of Sicilian Folk and Fairy Tales, collected by Laura Gunzenbach, a Swiss-German woman who grew up in Sicily in the 19th century. And these tales, there are 92 of them, are just remarkable because they were collected by this young woman in the 1860s, and all from peasant women in dialect, in Sicilian dialect. And she translated them right away into German, and the book was favorably reviewed when it came out in 1870, but it was buried. Nobody's translated it into English, and I decided, because I'm working on some other Sicilian projects and Italian folklore, that it was about time that American readers or English-speaking readers would have the opportunity to read these tales. And they're explosive. They're nitty-gritty. They're bawdy. They're erotic. They don't mince words. It's a totally different collection than the collection of the Brothers Grimm.
Did you have to translate them from her German translations, or were you able to get back to her sources?
Unfortunately, her sources, her manuscripts, were destroyed. If there were any, we don't even know. There was a earthquake in 1908 in Messina and destroyed a great part of the city. She was already dead. She had died earlier, but whatever papers that had been left behind in the family were destroyed. And it seems as though her understanding of Sicilian dialect was so perfect that she could write them directly into German. She was writing them for a friend of hers in Germany who really just wanted 2 or 3 tales and for the appendix of a book, and she wound up sending him 92, and he said, "My God, this is just so wonderful, I'll publish it as a separate book." And I'm anxiously looking forward to seeing how people respond to the book.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing it myself.
Great.
And what else are you bringing out?
Well, I'm also, I work with the Children's Theater Company of Minneapolis. I direct a storytelling program called Neighborhood Bridges. And the program, which has been in existence now, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul, is in its 5th year, and it was based on this book that I wrote called Creative Storytelling. And I'm now based on the experiences of the last 5 years. I've changed a lot of my methods. I've actually written stories for the program, and I will be publishing I guess in the summer, a book, a follow-up book, a complement called Speaking Out, Creative Storytelling and Creative Drama for Children. And so that right now that book is in the publisher's hands, and I'll probably be revising it during the winter.
Well, we'll look forward to that too. I'd like to thank you for talking with us today, and we've been talking with Professor Jack Zipes of the University of Minnesota, and this is TV Bookshelf.